December 7, 1941. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stands aboard his flagship, watching reports flood in from Pearl Harbor. His forces have achieved the impossible, crippling America's Pacific Fleet in a single devastating morning. Tokyo celebrates. The emperor rejoices. But Yamamoto does not smile. Instead, he utters words that would prove prophetic. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Within 18 months, Yamamoto would understand the true horror of what he had unleashed. This is the story of the exact moment when Japanese commanders realized they hadn't just attacked a nation, they had challenged the greatest industrial machine the world had ever seen. The morning after Pearl Harbor, Japanese military leadership gathered in Tokyo, euphoric with victory. They had destroyed or damaged 18 American ships, killed over 2,000 servicemen, and eliminated nearly 200 aircraft. Naval Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada declared it the greatest naval victory since Trafalgar. But there was one problem, one critical miscalculation that would doom the entire Japanese war effort. They had based their entire strategy on a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity. Japanese intelligence had done their homework, or so they thought. They knew America produced more steel than Japan. They knew American factories were numerous. But numbers on paper cannot capture reality. The Japanese high command believed that America was soft, divided, and lacked the will to fight a prolonged war. They calculated that after a devastating opening blow, America would negotiate peace, allowing Japan to secure its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They were catastrophically wrong. The first crack in Japanese confidence came just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, June 1942, the Battle of Midway. American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes, but that alone doesn't explain what happened. In a single battle, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, the heart of their naval air power. These weren't just ships. Each carrier represented years of construction, thousands of skilled workers, and resources Japan could barely afford to lose. American Admiral Chester Nimitz had turned the tide, but Japanese commanders still believed they could rebuild, that they could match American production. They had no idea what was coming. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was aboard the carrier Akagi at Midway. As he watched his ship burn and sink, he later wrote that he felt the first tremor of doubt. But it wasn't until he returned to Japan and spoke with naval engineers that the truth began to crystallize. Japan's shipyards could build perhaps one large carrier every 18 months, working at maximum capacity. When Fuchida asked about American capabilities, the answer he received made his blood run cold. American shipyards were launching a new Essex-class carrier every 8 weeks. Let that sink in. Every 8 weeks. Japan would spend a year and a half building one carrier. In that same time, America would launch 11. But carriers were just the beginning. Japanese naval officers began receiving intelligence reports throughout 1943 that seemed impossible. Surely the numbers were exaggerated. Surely American propaganda had inflated the figures. They hadn't. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, attended a classified briefing in early 1943. The numbers presented were so staggering that several officers openly questioned their accuracy. In 1942 alone, American shipyards had launched 8 aircraft carriers, 14 escort carriers, 4 battleships, 9 cruisers, and 128 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Japan's entire naval construction for the same year? 2 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. America was outbuilding Japan by a ratio of nearly 20 to 1. But Admiral Yamamoto understood something even more terrifying. He had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington and had traveled across the American heartland. In a private letter to a colleague in late 1942, Yamamoto wrote, "The American economy is not an economy of scarcity. It is an economy of abundance. When they shift to total war production, they will bury us in steel." He was right. But even Yamamoto underestimated what was coming. The revelation hit Japanese commanders in waves, each one more demoralizing than the last. First came the ships, then came the aircraft. In 1941, Japan had produced approximately 5,000 aircraft, more than respectable for an industrial power. Japanese Zero fighters were superior to most American aircraft at the war's start, faster, more maneuverable, with longer range. Japanese pilots were among the world's best, many with combat experience from China. Surely, Japanese commanders thought, America cannot match our quality. The quality argument died somewhere over the Pacific in 1943. American factories weren't just building planes, they were perfecting them. The F-6F Hellcat fighter entered service designed specifically to kill Zeros. It was faster, tougher, packed more firepower, and most importantly, it was being built in quantities that defied comprehension. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year. Japan's peak production? 28,000. American aircraft plants were operating 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers who had never seen an airplane before Pearl Harbor were now building them with assembly line precision that Henry Ford himself would have admired. Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai, an ace who survived the war, later described the moment he truly understood Japan had lost. It was during a mission over Rabaul in 1943. His squadron of 16 Zeros engaged what they thought was a small formation of American fighters. Within minutes, the sky was filled with American planes. They kept coming, wave after wave. Sakai counted over 60 enemy aircraft. His squadron was annihilated. Only 3 Japanese pilots made it home. Later, from intelligence reports, Sakai learned that the Americans had lost only 2 planes in the engagement. But what haunted him wasn't the losses. It was the casual nature of American power. Those 60 fighters were from just one carrier. America had dozens of carriers, and each one had more planes than entire Japanese air bases. Then came the submarines. Japanese commanders had invested heavily in their submarine fleet, building some of the largest and most sophisticated submarines in the world. The I-400 class could carry aircraft. Japanese submarine technology was cutting edge, but they made one critical mistake. They used submarines primarily to attack warships, following the traditional doctrine of naval warfare. America used submarines to strangle Japan's economy. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japan could replace them. But here's what broke Japanese naval command. Even when they managed to sink an American submarine, 2 more would appear to take its place. The United States built 288 submarines during the war. Japan started the war with the 3rd largest submarine fleet in the world. By 1945, it had been reduced to nearly nothing, not primarily by combat losses, but because they couldn't replace losses while America could replace them faster than Japan could sink them. Admiral Soemu Toyota, who became commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet in 1944, held a meeting with his staff that summer. According to records declassified after the war, Toyota presented an analysis that shocked everyone in the room. He had calculated that for every ton of shipping Japan could build, America was building 16 tons. For every plane Japan manufactured, America made 7. For every tank, America made 5. For every trained pilot Japan could produce, America was training 8. The mathematics of destruction were undeniable. Japan was drowning in American steel. But perhaps the most devastating realization came from captured American equipment. When Japanese forces overran American positions in the Philippines and other early campaigns, they captured supplies. What they found horrified military analysts. American soldiers carried weapons of a quality and quantity that seemed wasteful. Every infantryman had a semi-automatic M1 Garand rifle, 8 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition fired as fast as you could pull the trigger. Japanese soldiers carried bolt-action rifles that required manual operation after each shot. American squad automatic weapons could sustain fire that Japanese light machine guns couldn't match. But it wasn't the weapons themselves that shocked Japanese observers. It was the disposability. If an American radio broke, soldiers would discard it and requisition a new one. If boots wore out, new ones appeared. Japanese forces were trained to make do, to repair, to conserve every bullet and grain of rice. American forces operated under the assumption that supplies were infinite, and the terrifying reality was that compared to Japanese logistics, they essentially were. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the conqueror of Singapore and one of Japan's finest commanders, captured documents after the fall of Bataan that included American supply manifests. He later told interrogators that seeing the supplies allocated to a single American division, supplies that included everything from 50 different types of spare parts to ice cream making machines, made him understand that Japan was fighting an enemy that existed in a different industrial dimension. The numbers became a nightmare that haunted the Japanese general staff. In 1943, America produced 47 million tons of steel. Japan produced barely 8 million. America mined 600 million tons of coal. Japan mined 55 million. American factories produced 86,000 tanks during the entire war. Japan produced 6,000. The disparity wasn't measured in percentages. It was measured in orders of magnitude. By 1944, Japanese commanders faced a reality that military historians would later call the arithmetic of defeat. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, wrote in his diary, "We are not fighting a nation. We are fighting a force of nature, an industrial typhoon that cannot be stopped, only endured." The kamikaze attacks that began in October 1944 were not acts of fanaticism born from strength. They were acts of desperation born from the mathematical certainty of defeat. The kamikazes represent perhaps the clearest evidence that Japanese commanders understood they could not win a conventional war of attrition. When a nation resorts to using pilots as guided missiles, it is because they have concluded that the pilot is more expendable than the aircraft and fuel, because they cannot replace either. America was shooting down kamikazes and replacing lost aircraft within days. Japan was losing irreplaceable pilots and aircraft they could never rebuild. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, a senior staff officer who helped plan the kamikaze strategy, later admitted that the decision was born from despair. Japanese admirals had calculated that conventional attacks might achieve a 3% hit rate against American ships. Kamikaze attacks might achieve a 15% hit rate. But even at 15%, even if they sacrificed every pilot in Japan, they could not sink ships faster than American shipyards could build them. The math was unforgiving. The final crushing realization came with the B-29 Superfortress. When these massive bombers began appearing over Japan in late 1944, Japanese fighter pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. The B-29 could fly higher than most Japanese fighters could climb, carried more bombs than some Japanese ships could hold, and was so heavily armored that shooting one down required dozens of hits, and America had hundreds of them, soon to be thousands. Japanese air defenses threw everything at the B-29 raids. Fighters, anti-aircraft guns, even ramming attacks. It didn't matter. The bombers kept coming, night after night, city after city. By March 1945, when B-29s firebombed Tokyo, killing over 100,000 people in a single night, Japanese commanders knew with absolute certainty that they had unleashed something they could never defeat. Emperor Hirohito himself expressed the final acknowledgement of American industrial supremacy. In his surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, he stated, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable." But in private conversations recorded by the imperial household, Hirohito said something more revealing. "We cannot continue a war where the enemy possesses the industrial capacity to build weapons we cannot even imagine." After the war, American occupation forces brought Japanese military leaders to tour American factories. Admiral Toyota visited the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford had built B-24 bombers. The factory was 1 mile long. At peak production, it completed one bomber every 63 minutes. Toyota stood in silence for several minutes, then said through his translator, "Now I understand why we lost. You were not fighting a war. You were demonstrating industrial capacity. We never had a chance." The moment Japanese commanders realized the true scale of American industrial might wasn't a single instant. It was a cascading series of revelations, each one stripping away another layer of hope, until all that remained was the undeniable mathematics of industrial warfare. They had attacked Pearl Harbor believing they faced a nation unprepared for war. They discovered too late that they had attacked a nation that could arm the world. American factories didn't just win the war in the Pacific. They armed the British, supplied the Soviets, equipped the Chinese, and still had enough surplus to overwhelm Japan with sheer material superiority. The arsenal of democracy wasn't propaganda. It was a statement of fact. And by the time Japanese commanders fully understood this, their cities were burning, their fleet was at the bottom of the ocean, and their industrial base had been bombed into rubble by weapons they could never hope to match. The lesson was clear, brutal, and absolute. You cannot win a modern war against an enemy who can replace their losses faster than you can inflict them. Japan had awakened a giant, and that giant had buried them in steel.